We occasionally come across people who go deep in life and in their other passions. Christine Chow is not only a passionate sustainability professional, but she is a passionate horsewoman. Hear what she has learned from dressage and the horse drives that facilitate adaptive grazing. I'm Aoife Devitt, and welcome to the 50 Faces Love series, where we're focused on professionals who also have a love outside their professional work that we believe adds to that, and we want to hear about that passion. I'm joined today by Christine Chow, who's a sustainable investment professional, a role she's held for over 20 years. She has also had a passion for horse riding for the extent of that time, and we're going to talk about that passion for horses, which started in the early 2000s. Welcome, Christine. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Eva. Thank you for having me on your podcast.
Well, we have a fantastically detailed podcast about your sustainable investment work, and that's in series 1. And I'll put a link to that in the show notes. But ever since I've known you, I've known about the passion you've had for horses. We talked about it during COVID when you couldn't get to see your horses. I've seen some great videos, not only of you participating in dressage, but also of you participating in a horse drive in Idaho in the US last summer, which looked absolutely fascinating and sweeping, certainly in terms of its breadth. So I'd love to talk to you about the horse riding passion that you've had for over 20 years, how it started and what you learned from it. So can you tell us about what first interested you in horses?
Sure. It was actually quite unexpected because I was trying to get fit after I gave birth to my son. And I was living in Dubai at the time. And Arab horses are beautiful. Actually, all horses are beautiful. And I had the opportunity to go and ride in the desert. I still remember getting up in the morning as the sun was rising, because that was the only time pretty much that you can ride in the UAE. Otherwise, it would be too hot later in the day. So I'll be driving into the desert, jump on a horse and start chasing gazelles. Well, not in a bad way, but, just going with friends. And that becomes a little bit more serious as I want to learn more about psychology of the horse, how to be a better sportsman, how to be a better horse owner. At one point, I had a horse as well. And I guess what fascinates me was that most people actually start riding at a very young age, especially in Europe and North America, and actually elsewhere as well, Latin America, everywhere. Children start at about 4 or 5, 6, 7 years old. Whereas I started in my 30s, early 30s. So very much a latecomer, but it doesn't really stop one from learning if you want to learn about the principles and the technique. So for me, equestrian sport is special because it is a sport that requires 2 individuals. And we don't even speak the same language, right? A horse and human. But you can speak the same language. Just not verbally, potentially. You can speak by feeling it. And it's an unusual sport because it is about feeling as much as training. And we do things that require fitness and coordination, a lot of courage and resilience. Because if you go to a competition, a sports competition, you focus on yourself as a sportsman. However, if you go to a show or a competition with a horse, it's about the fitness of the two. The physical fitness, the mental fitness, and something could go terribly wrong. And if you compete to the highest level for some equestrian, that 6 minutes or 8 minutes at the Grand Prix or Olympic level, that could be the highlight of your life in that 6 minutes. And that's a lot to wait for, but it's totally worth it. I mean, not that I got that, but I've seen people who have, and it's absolutely amazing. It requires intelligence, fast reflexes, and quick decision-making and trust. So all these are really good things we learn in life.
Do you think there was any barrier to starting in your 30s? Do you think anyone can take up this sport in their 30s? Or did you have to work particularly hard maybe to build that muscle memory that maybe some of your peers had developed since being a child?
I think the biggest barrier in anything that we want to do is fear that we impose on ourselves. Of course, for a child, it's easier to pick up a skill quite naturally that you start up with. And you bounce, right, when you're young. And obviously, I don't bounce anymore, and not in the way that I want to. But no, if you really want something, No, that shouldn't be a barrier. And I think we had many stories where 70-year-old starts doing ballet. There's some really good examples out there. So no, horse riding, start anytime you want. You probably don't want to go into cross-country jumping if you start at 60, but no. We have equestrian competing at the Olympic level. If you remember in Japan, but a few years ago in his 70s.
And tell us about some of the highlights of your passion so far. We can talk about maybe dressage first, and then I'd love to hear about that horse drive.
Yeah, I actually have a book that I wrote notes on what I've learned about dressage. For those who don't know what that term means, dressage means taming for training. It sounds like quite a fancy term, but essentially it is about building a partnership and trying to bring the best out of the horse in their ability to deliver the movements that you see in the show. So the horses that dance is usually how people interpret that. And why do they dance? How do they dance? It looks totally effortless. And I can tell you it's not. It's through many, many years of training. So we're having this conversation now in January 2023. I'm actually going to Spain, at the Royal School, Equestrian School in Jerez later this month. It is one of the 4 very old equestrian schools in Europe. Every year they open a technical dressage course for people who are not professional rider, but good enough rider to go and ride their performance horses in their performance hall. And the experience is about learning the skill and also fine-tuning and perfecting it. And during that process, I found it fascinating that I'll be able to apply the principles of dressage to a much higher level with the right support.
And I'd love to know, does the horse itself enjoy that process of dressage? Does it enjoy the dancing, the discipline, the very precise movements? How do you interpret that?
Horses are only beautiful when you see them because they enjoy what they do. Because when they don't enjoy what they do, you can see on their faces, maybe the teeth will start yanking, pulling the reins, and they wouldn't know, you will know it, you will see it. And do they enjoy dressage? Well, if it's done well. Sometimes some dressage techniques would push the horses to a very high level because of competition. But if you look at dressage as a classical training technique, it's to bring out the beauty and the ability of the horse. Yes, they do, because you're allowing them, when encouraging them to express themselves. So if you see horses naturally in the field, sometimes they would do some high-level dressage movements. They called passaging or piaffing, which is if you have to train them to do at the moment you want them to do it, requires a lot of skill. But naturally, they do it because they're excited. They want to show off. They want to show off that they can do it. And so if it's done well, yes, definitely they will enjoy it. But there are a lot of people, because they want to push for performance, if they're using a lot of pressure on the horse, when they're not ready to deliver, then it could cause some issue.
Well, let's tie that back then to the day job, some of those disciplines. I'd love to, first of all, I hope you someday publish those notes, what you've learned from dressage, because I think that would be a fascinating read for those of us who are kind of looking into that sport from afar. But first of all, how has that affected how you approach your work in terms of striving for perfection, performance, collaboration? And just more broadly, I know that you've undertaken campaigns in the past to encourage all colleagues to speak more about what drives them, their passions outside work, because you think that when you speak to their authenticity, to their richness, to their diversity. Can you talk a little bit about those 2 principles?
Sure. Well, let's start off with how I find the parallels between sustainable investment or active ownership, stewardship with riding. I learned a lot, probably more than my PhD on the subject from riding, because a lot of people think that engagement with companies is about putting pressure on them to change. I think there's a certain level of pressure. Like I would still give my horse a little bit of pressure when I want to continue to improve. But ultimately, it is about understanding. Engagement is a two-way process, and same as building a relationship with an animal. We don't speak the same language. And some would say that investors and companies don't speak the same language. Maybe sometimes that's true. And success, sustained success, whether it is riding or engagement with companies, has to be built on understanding and respect. So if we can change the mind of a horse to say that, no, this is the way to express yourself and to be moving. In riding, it would be us, in dressage, would be encouraging the horse to move his back better so that we can ride them better, moving in the right way. And for companies would be change the mind of how they are looking at their business. Do they acknowledge climate change as an issue? What are they doing to address those issues? We identify whether it is risk or opportunities. So the idea is that you change the mind, we're the horse or company, and then the act will follow. So the change itself would happen because they want to happen, whether it's a company or horse. And I think good active ownership activities is about encouraging that understanding. So the change is brought along by those who are engaging in that process. And then back to what I was saying earlier about not all horses would get to the point where they need to be. Not every horse is an Olympic horse, right? So it's understanding what is possible, what is realistic when we talk about engaging with principles or objectives that are achievable. That's important. You can't ask a company to achieve what they cannot, especially if they cannot control all the parameters for that change. So if assessment and education is continuous, it's the same for riding, but also for ourselves, as well as when we're doing our work. And I think that's the last one I want to mention is that good riding requires a strong core, like in sports, and light hands. It's not about yanking the horse in the mouth to make them to submit. It is about the firm principles of what makes good riding. What makes good active ownership is to have firm principles, but implemented with compassion, with understanding, give people time and encouragement. So it is true in horsemanship and also in active ownership. So yeah, I see a lot of parallels and always reflect on those.
And when you think about asking other people about a similar question, a bit like this podcast series, what drives you? What's your passion? Other people have different passions like yours, maybe musical performance, it might be travel, it might be crafting. What have you learned from asking the same question across the company in terms of what that's shown you about your colleagues, about what drives them?
It's been fascinating to look at it from that perspective. You can call it a we engage approach, a we engage campaign. I had that idea because I wanted to connect with colleagues in a way that I can better understand how they think. So we all talk about bringing authenticity, at work. And the message to colleagues is that we care about them as individuals, as people, and we care about what interests them. So for me, that is the first point of why I want to ask, what do you enjoy doing? Right? And how do you apply what you enjoy doing, what you learn from your personal interests at work? So some people haven't thought about it and then thought, oh, that's quite interesting. Another reason is actually lateral thinking. So we talk about bringing authenticity at work so that we show that we care. We talk about being able to encourage cognitive diversity because we are seeing how different people interpret the world through different lenses. And then the third thing is encouraging lateral thinking because the ability to take one set of learning in an area and apply that to seemingly a completely different and unconnected use cases at work. It does encourage lateral thinking. It frees the mind for me. It's liberating as an experience. And of course, the last reason is to find new ways to collaborate. Some colleagues, how companies in general, we tend to work in silos because you're in one team, you're in a different office. And then when you ask people what you enjoy doing, oh, I found out that someone actually came to me from a different office in a completely different team and said, I love show jumping. I love horses. So there's one. And then I found out that some might really enjoy musical performance specifically, and some like piano, some just like doing violin virtuoso. But when they explain how they interpret, how their values and skills inform their work, the interpretation is completely different. And that's how I can demonstrate there is definitely cognitive diversity because the way they interpret the world is different. And it's a way to engage with people. So thoroughly enjoy, and I highly recommend that this is a way to really get to know people in a deeper way, in a very personal way, in the way they want it. Of course, this is a voluntary exercise.
And of course, it can be the case sometimes that a systems thinking approach can take over, and what you learn from your passion can directly impact the work that you do. The Idaho Horse Drive looked from the outside like a wonderful pursuit of a sport. being in the great outdoors. But it seems that there was also an underlying lesson there in terms of sustainable agriculture. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, of course. There's been a lot of discussion in the investment industry about the opportunities in biodiversity and nature-based solution, regenerative agriculture. So one of the cases I came across in my reading is that in the Chihuahuan Desert in North America, because over the years, some of the natural species like bisons who have a particular migration pattern have died out over time. And therefore, the richness of the soil health has suffered. So there was a case study by some cowboys in the Baquera. I think it's called the Baquera. They have taken their cattle herd, their cows, and mimic that migration pattern of the bisons who've gone extinct and be able to graze in a particular, I think it's an adaptive way of grazing that have revitalized the area. I think it's taken about 15 years. It's a very long time, but it actually shows how powerful if we learn from nature. And what I did was a horse drive, so it was slightly different. But there's definitely cattle drives that allows us to learn much more about the grazing pattern of different livestock. So I learned about the fact that you can actually mix sheep and horse and cows in their grazing because they actually eat different types of grass or different parts of it. And the grazing pattern is different. So you can actually find ways to improve the adaptive grazing performance of livestock as well. So I'm still learning about it and reading up on it. And all these are connected to what we enjoy doing. I think plenty of parallels between personal interests and work to be found.
Well, I will put some links to those articles in the show notes. And that, of course, is very validating because that's exactly my hunch, is that there are connections everywhere. And it is, as you mentioned, lateral thinking, drawing analogies, giving us a richness with which to understand our day-to-day is only going to make us better at our day jobs. So thank you so much, Christine, for coming here and giving us a window into the rich world of dressage, horse drives, and horse riding in general. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice, and all views are personal and should not be attributed to the organisations and affiliations of the host or any guest.